There is a phenomenon I have observed in my long years of sitting beside the troubled and the searching, a phenomenon that has no convenient name in the language of our textbooks, but which every old physician of the soul has felt in the room more than once. And it is this: a person enters who has, for many years, dimmed themselves to almost nothing, who has folded their light inward the way a great house folds its shutters against a storm that lasted a generation. And then, for reasons that are at first invisible, the light begins to return, not all at once, not in any way that could be photographed or measured by the instruments of our age. It returns the way warmth returns to a stone that has been long in the shade and is at last turned to face the sun. Slowly, almost reluctantly, with a kind of disbelief in the stone itself that warmth is permitted, and yet the warmth comes, and the stone grows luminous in a manner that is felt before it is seen. I have come to call this the returning aura of the empath, and I want to spend our evening together speaking of it, because in the presence of such a returning, something happens to the people gathered around that person which is, in its way, one of the strangest and most truthful events the human soul can witness. The masks fall, not because the empath has demanded it, not because they have spoken a word, but because the light that returns in them is the light of the self, and the self, when it shines even faintly through one human life, exposes by its mere presence everything in the surrounding lives that has been arranged against the truth. I want you to understand, before we go further into the matter, that I do not use the word aura in the loose and decorative sense in which our century has come to use it. I mean something quite precise. Though it cannot be measured by precise instruments, I mean the quality of psychic atmosphere that surrounds a human being, the felt weather of their inner life as it radiates into the room they occupy. Every person carries such an atmosphere. The man who has spent 30 years suppressing a great grief carries a particular heaviness around him, and the people in his life have learned, without knowing they have learned it, to breathe more shallowly in his presence. The woman who has built her entire personality around the pretense of cheerfulness carries a brightness that has the curious property of leaving the other person obscurely tired afterward, as though one had been illuminated by a lamp that gave off no warmth. These atmospheres are real. They are the radiation of the unconscious into the shared field between souls. And they are perceived, not by the rational mind which dismisses them, but by the older organ of perception which is in all of us and which we ignore at the cost of our deepest knowing. The empath, of whom we are speaking tonight, is a person whose atmosphere has, for most of their life, been dimmed. They have been carrying a light which they were taught very early to conceal, sometimes because the people around them could not bear it, sometimes because they themselves could not bear the consequences of being seen, sometimes for reasons that go back to the long inheritance of a family in which luminosity was treated as a kind of dangerous indiscretion. And then, somewhere in their middle years, or sometimes earlier, sometimes much later, the dimming begins to lift, and the light begins to come forward into the atmosphere again. And that is the event I wish to examine with you. The lifting does not happen, as the popular books would have you believe, because the empath has read the right book, or attended the right course, or pronounced the right affirmation in front of a mirror. The lifting happens because something in the deep psyche has decided, in its own time and by its own counsel, that the long contraction has reached its end. I have seen this many times, and the patient is always at first as astonished as the people around them, They come to me and they say, "Doctor, something is happening that I do not understand. I find myself unable to perform the small dishonesties that used to be automatic to me. I find myself, against my will, speaking the truer thing in conversations where the prudent course would be to remain quiet. I find myself looking at faces I have known for 20 years and seeing them, for the first time, as they actually are, and I cannot tell whether I am becoming wise or becoming ill. I tell them, in such cases, that they are becoming neither, that they are becoming themselves, and that the becoming of oneself is a process that very often resembles illness in its early stages, because the persona, which had been doing the work of holding the social order together inside one's life, is loosening, and the loosening of the persona produces in the surrounding people a discomfort which they will, almost without exception, attribute to a fault in the empath rather than to a movement in the empath's depths. This is the price of the returning, and we shall come to it. But first I want to describe the returning itself, because it is, in my long experience, one of the most beautiful events the soul can undergo, and it deserves to be honored before we speak of its cost. The returning of the aura is, in essence, the slow surfacing of the self, which is the term I have used to name the deepest center of a human being, the inner figure that contains the totality of who one is and is. At the same time, mysteriously connected to something greater than the individual, to what the ancients called the divine spark in the soul, what the alchemists called the gold hidden in the matter, what every contemplative tradition has known by some local name and what no name fully captures. The self has been there all along. It is not produced by the work of individuation. It is, rather, the goal and the source of that work, the figure that has been waiting in the depths for the conscious life to turn at last and recognize it. In the long dimmed years of the empath, the self has not been absent. It has been present like a fire under a heavy stone, giving its warmth into the body and the dreams and the inexplicable longings of the person, but unable to come forward into the daylight of their conscious life because the layers above it, the persona, the complexes, the inherited fears, the wound from a particular childhood, were too dense for its light to pass through. What changes when the returning begins is that those layers grow thin. They do not vanish. They become, instead, translucent, the way a screen of paper grows translucent when a lamp is held behind it. And the figure of the self, which had been only a presence felt in the body, begins to be visible in the manner of the person, in the steadiness of their eyes, in the quality of their voice when they speak of the things that matter to them, in the strange new ease with which they refuse what is false and consent to what is true. I think now of a woman who came to me in the late autumn of a particular year, a woman who had spent 30 years inside a marriage in which her own intelligence had been treated as a kind of furniture that the husband occasionally moved when it inconvenienced him. She had not been brutalized in any way the world would recognize. She had simply been gradually arranged, over decades, into a smaller and smaller shape, until the shape was so small that she herself had ceased to remember what her larger form had felt like, and she had come to believe that the shrinking was her own doing and her own nature. When she first sat in my consulting room, she spoke with the particular flat cheerfulness that I have come to associate with people whose inner light has been long suppressed, a cheerfulness that is not warmth, but the absence of any temperature at all. and she described their life to me in the manner of someone reading aloud from a document she did not author. I asked her, after some weeks, what she dreamed of, and she told me she had not remembered a dream in many years. I told her, gently, that her dreams had not stopped. Only her listening to them had stopped, and that if she would consent to keep a small notebook beside her bed, the dreams would begin to come forward again, because the unconscious is patient and has been waiting. Within a month she returned with 3 dreams written in a careful hand, and in all 3 dreams there was a figure of a woman walking ahead of her in a long corridor, a woman she could not quite catch, whose face she could not see, but whose presence she recognized with the deep recognition that one has only for one's own deeper life. That figure, I told her, is you. She is walking ahead of you because she has been walking ahead of you for 30 years, waiting for you to remember her. And the corridor is the inner house of your psyche, in which there are many rooms you have not entered. You are not chasing her, you are following her home. The woman wept then, and the weeping was not the small ornamental weeping of the persona, but the great old weeping of a self that has been long unseen and is at last being acknowledged. And from that hour, the returning began in her, slowly at first, then with a kind of inevitability that astonished us both. I have been speaking to you of the returning as though it were a single event, but I want now to slow our examination and acknowledge that it is, in truth, a long sequence of small returnings, each of which carries its own crisis and its own deepening. The first returning is usually the smallest and the most private. The empath becomes aware, in some quiet hour, that they have been performing a version of themselves which is no longer entirely their own. And the awareness, once arrived, cannot be unmade. They may try to push it away, they may attempt, for weeks or months, to resume the old performance with renewed conviction. But the awareness sits behind their eyes now like a small lamp that has been lit and that no act of will can extinguish. And the lamp, however dim, makes every subsequent gesture of the old life slightly visible to them as a gesture. Where before it had felt like simple being, this visibility is the beginning, and it is often experienced as a kind of mild grief, because the old performance had been comfortable in the way that any long habit is comfortable. And the empath, at this stage, does not yet know what will take its place. They know only that something has shifted, and the shifting cannot be unshifted. And they walk through their days with the strange double consciousness of one who is still inside the old life and yet no longer fully convinced by it. I have come to recognize this stage with particular tenderness, because it is the stage at which the patient is most easily discouraged, most easily persuaded by the surrounding voices that they are imagining things, that they should be grateful for what they have, that the disturbance in them is a failure of character rather than the first stirring of their deeper life. Many empaths, faced with these surrounding voices, dim themselves again at this point. And the second dimming is sadder than the first, because it is a dimming undertaken in awareness rather than in innocence. And the soul knows what it has refused. For those who do not turn back, however, the second returning soon arrives, and it is larger than the first, and it concerns the dreams, the unconscious, which has been waiting all along, perceives that conscious attention has finally turned toward it, and it begins to send messages of increasing clarity and depth. The patient, who could not remember a dream now, finds that dreams arrive nightly, sometimes in such procession that the morning is hardly long enough to write them all down, and the dreams begin to contain figures of an archetypal order that have not, in ein literal sense, been part of the patient's previous mental life. They dream of a great house with rooms they have never entered. They dream of an old woman by a well who hands them a cup. They dream of an animal that speaks to them in a voice they recognize as their own. They dream of a dark man at the edge of a forest who does not threaten them and whom they cannot quite see. They dream of a child who is themselves at 5, or at 7, or at the age they were when the long dimming began, and the child looks at them with eyes that ask a question, and they wake with the question still in them, unable to formulate it in words. These are not random images. They are the language in which the deeper psyche speaks, and the empath at this stage of the returning is being given, by their own depths, a kind of education that no outer schooling can provide, an education in the symbols by which the self announces itself, the archetypes through which the collective unconscious speaks its old wisdoms to the individual life. Many empaths at this stage feel that they are going mad. They are not. They are being met by what has been waiting to meet them. And the strangeness of the meeting is only the strangeness that any long-buried truth carries when it first comes into the daylight. The third returning is the one that concerns the body. And I want to dwell on this for a moment because our age, which thinks of itself as scientific, has been remarkably slow to understand what the body does when the soul begins to return to itself. The empath, who has dimmed themselves for many years, has done so partly through a contraction in the body, a tightening of the breath, a holding in the shoulders, a quiet refusal in the belly to take up its full space in the world. They have made themselves smaller bodily, because the bodily smallness was part of the social contract under which they were permitted to exist. When the returning reaches this layer, and it always does in time, the body begins to release its long holdings, and the release is not painless. There may be a period of weeks or months in which the empath finds themselves weeping at unexpected moments, not from any new sorrow, but from the surfacing of old sorrows that the body had been carrying in storage. There may be physical symptoms that the doctors cannot quite explain, a heaviness in the chest, a strange new sensitivity to sound or light or the moods of strangers in a public place, a tiredness that no amount of sleep relieves. The body is doing the work the conscious mind cannot do directly. It is dismantling the old configuration through which the soul had been compressed into a manageable shape. And the dismantling, like any honest work, takes its time and exacts its cost. I have come to believe that much of what is treated in our hurried clinics as ordinary depression or anxiety in middle-aged people is in fact this third returning, the body's slow recovery of its truth, and that the proper response is not the suppression of the symptoms but the patient witnessing of what the body is doing, the gentle accompaniment of one's own physical depths through the long surfacing they have undertaken on the soul's behalf. The fourth returning, and the one that most concerns the title under which we have gathered tonight, is the returning of the aura itself, the becoming visible in the outer field of what has been completed in the inner one. By this stage, the empath has done a great deal of quiet work. The persona has loosened, the dreams have been received, the body has begun to inhabit its full shape again. And now something happens which the empath did not seek and could not have produced by any effort. Other people begin to look at them differently. Strangers in shops linger a moment longer. Children stare. The old animals of the household come to them with a new attention. Friends who have known them for decades say, in the offhand way that such things are usually said, that there is something different about them lately. They cannot quite name it. Perhaps they have lost weight. Perhaps they have started a new diet. Perhaps they have been on holiday. Perhaps they are in love. The empath knows that none of these explanations is correct. But the friends are not wrong that something has changed in the field. And what has changed is that the self, which had been buried under the long compression, is now near enough to the surface that it radiates. And the radiation is what people are perceiving when they say there is something different. They are perceiving the aura of a soul that has begun to return to itself. And they are perceiving it through that old organ in themselves, which is always perceiving such things, and which the conscious mind almost never credits. The empath at this stage often becomes shy about the looking. They feel exposed in a way they had not felt before, because the dimming had been, among other things, a kind of protection, and the protection is now gone. They walk into rooms and feel that they are taking up more space than they have permission to take. They speak and notice that people listen with a different attention than before. They are tempted, at moments, to dim themselves again, simply for the relief of being unnoticed. But this is the last of the great temptations of the returning, and to yield to it now, after so much has been undertaken, would be to refuse the gift at the very moment it is being given, and the soul does not lightly forgive such refusals. What I want to say about this fourth returning, and what I want you to remember if you carry nothing else away from our evening, is that the visibility which the returned aura brings is not a personal achievement. It is not something the empath has accomplished by their own striving, and it is not something they should congratulate themselves for. And it is therefore also not something they should be ashamed of when other people respond to it. The aura that has returned is the aura of the self, which is in everyone, which has always been in everyone, and which is shining through this particular human being now, because this particular human being has done the long work of clearing the layers above it. The empath in whom the light has returned is, in a sense, a kind of accidental teacher in their own surroundings, not because they have set out to teach anything, but because the presence of an undimmed soul in a field of dimmed souls is itself an instruction. And the instruction is, the self is real in you also. The layers above it can be made translucent. The long compression can come to an end. This is the message the returned aura carries, and it carries it without any words being spoken. And the people who are ready to hear it begin to undertake their own work in response. And the people who are not ready experience the message as accusation and turn against the empath with a force that astonishes everyone involved. We have spoken already of why this is so, and we shall not need to repeat ourselves, but I want you to see that the empath, in the period of the fourth returning, is not really being praised or attacked as themselves. They are being praised and attacked as a doorway through which something has come into the field that the field had not arranged to welcome. And the praise and the attack are not finally about the empath at all. They are about each person's own relation to the self that the empath has, without intending it. Made temporarily visible, there remains then the question of how the empath is to live inside this returned aura, how they are to carry the visibility without being deformed by it in either direction, neither inflated by the new attention they receive, nor crushed by the new attacks that arrive alongside the attention. This is the matter for which the rest of our evening must prepare us, and it is a matter of practical wisdom as much as of mystical depth. because the soul that has returned to itself must still live in the ordinary world, must still buy bread and walk in the street and answer the telephone and meet the eyes of the relations who knew them before the returning began. The first piece of wisdom I would offer is that the empath must learn, after the long work, to receive themselves as the recipient and not the source of the light they now carry. This is a fine distinction and a vital one. The persona, even at this late stage, is capable of an extraordinary trick, which is to reconfigure itself around the very gift that was meant to dissolve it, to take the returned aura and make of it a new costume, a spiritual costume, a costume that says, "Look at me, I am the one in whom the light has returned. I am the awakened one. I am the seer among the unseeing." This is the inflation of which I have written warningly in many places, and it is the particular shadow of the returning. The way every great movement of the psyche has its own characteristic shadow, the empath who falls into this inflation does not realize they have fallen, because the inflation feels from inside like a perfectly justified recognition of what has actually occurred. The aura has returned, the seeing has deepened. The capacity to read the field has become quite remarkable, and the small voice of the persona, reconstituted now in spiritual robes, says, "Yes, all this is true, and it is yours, and you are now a being of a higher order than the people around you who have not undertaken the work." This is a great fall, and it is more difficult to recover from than the original dimming, because it wears the clothing of the achievement and is therefore very hard to recognize as a regression. The safeguard against it, the only safeguard I have ever found reliable, is to remember, hourly if necessary, that the light is not yours, that you are its bearer and not its origin, and that the bearer is honored by being a clear vessel and dishonored by mistaking themselves for the wine. The second piece of wisdom is that the empath must, in the period of the returned aura, develop a particular relation to the attacks that arrive, a relation which is neither defensive nor permissive. The persona of others, when it is exposed by the empath's presence, will sometimes lash out, and the lashing out can be quite cruel, and it can take forms the empath had not anticipated: sudden coldness from old friends, accusations of arrogance from family members who had previously seemed devoted, the slow withdrawal of social invitations, the strange new reputation that begins to attach to one's name in circles where one had been thought of warmly before. These are the natural consequences of being a doorway through which the self has become visible in a field that had not arranged for such visibility. And they are not to be taken personally in the way one ordinarily takes such things personally. The empath who takes them personally will either harden, becoming bitter and self-righteous, or soften, becoming apologetic and willing to dim themselves again in exchange for the restoration of the old affections. Both responses miss what is actually happening, which is that the people lashing out are wrestling with their own unfinished material, are being met inside themselves by figures and feelings they had not expected to meet, and are, in the only language they know, asking the empath either to retreat or to take responsibility for the disturbance the empath did not in any deliberate sense cause. The mature response, which is learned slowly and never perfectly, is to hold the steady knowledge that one has not done anything wrong, while also holding the compassionate knowledge that the other person is in genuine difficulty, and to remain, as far as possible, simply present. neither retreating into the old dimming nor advancing into argument and self-defense. This is a form of inner standing still that requires great practice, and it is what the old contemplatives meant when they spoke of being immovable, not in the sense of being unfeeling, but in the sense of being unmoved from the ground of one's own truth by the weather of another's reactivity. The third piece of wisdom concerns what the empath does with the seeing. Now that the seeing has become so much clearer than it was before. In the earlier years of the dimming, the empath saw a great deal, but did not always trust what they saw, and the not trusting was, paradoxically, a kind of protection because it kept them from acting too quickly on incomplete perceptions. With the returning of the aura, the seeing becomes both clearer and more trusted. And the empath finds themselves able to read the field of any room they enter with a precision that startles them. They know, within minutes, the central wound of a person they have just met. They know, in a glance, which member of a family carries the unprocessed grief for the whole system. They know, when they walk through a town, which houses are filled with unspoken sorrow and which are lit by a more secret joy. This seeing is real, and it is now reliable in a way it was not before. And the question that arises is, what one does with it. The temptation, in the inflated condition we have already discussed, is to begin to speak the seeing, to offer interpretations to people who have not asked for them, to become a kind of unwelcome oracle in one's social field. This is almost always a mistake. The seeing is given to the empath for their own orientation in the world, not as a public service to be performed upon unwilling recipients. There are times when the seeing must be spoken, when a soul in genuine need asks an honest question and an honest answer is required, and at such times the empath who has done the long work will know by an inward steadying that the moment has come and the words may rise. But these times are rarer than the empath often imagines, and most of the seeing is meant to be held simply in the inner sanctuary and to inform the empath's conduct. The way an experienced doctor's diagnostic intuitions inform his bedside manner without his constantly announcing his diagnosis to the patient, the seeing serves the relation. The relation is not subordinated to the seeing. This is a subtle reordering of the empath's whole way of being, and it is the mark of the matured returning that the reordering has begun to take hold. I want to say something now, before the lamp burns lower, about the rare aura itself, because the title of our evening has used a particular adjective, and the adjective deserves our attention. I have called the aura that returns the aura of the self, and I have said that the self is in everyone, and you might therefore wonder in what sense such an aura is rare. The answer is that the aura is not rare in its essence, because every soul carries the self at its center. But it is rare in its visibility, because most souls have not undertaken the long clearing of the layers that allows the self to shine into the surrounding field. We live in an age in which the layers are particularly dense, in which the persona has been industrialized and commodified and rewarded at every turn, in which the dimming of souls has been accepted as the price of social participation. And in such an age, the soul that has returned to itself is, of necessity, an uncommon sight. It need not be so, and I do not say this as a condemnation of our age, only as a description of it. The aura is rare not because it is reserved for a chosen few, but because few have been given, or have given themselves, the conditions under which the long work of returning can be undertaken. Where such conditions exist, where a soul has been broken open by suffering or by love or by some encounter with the symbolic that the rational mind cannot dismiss, and where the soul has then been given the time and the inwardness and the patient witnessing that the work requires, the returning happens, and the aura becomes visible, and the masks around such a soul begin to fall. It can happen in a peasant's cottage, it can happen in a king's palace, it can happen in the consulting room of an old physician in Zurich, and it can happen in a small kitchen at the back of a house in a village whose name the historians will never record. The rarity is not in the soul, the rarity is in the conditions. And the conditions, I have come to believe, are more available than we usually admit, if only we will consent to enter them when they are offered. And so we come to the quiet end of what I had to say to you this evening. And the lamp is lower now, and the night outside the window has grown thick and patient. I have spoken to you of the empath whose light returns, of the aura that becomes visible when the long dimming ends, of the masks that fall in the surrounding field, of the four returnings by which the work unfolds, and of the wisdoms by which the returned soul lives in the ordinary world. If you are such an empath, and if some part of what I have said has answered something in you that you have carried for many years without finding a name for it, then I want you to know that the long disturbance in you is not a fault. It is the stirring of your deeper life, and it has its own intelligence, and you have not been mistaken about what you have been feeling. The world will not, in most cases, confirm the truth of your inner work. The confirmation must come from inside, from the slow steadying of your own ground, from the dreams that arrive and the body that releases its old holdings, and the strange new ease with which you find yourself able to refuse what is false and to consent to what is true. Trust this. Trust it more than you trust the voices that would persuade you to dim again. And if you are not such an empath, but you have one in your life, a wife, a husband, a friend, a parent, a grown child whose aura has begun to return, then I ask you to consider that what you are witnessing is not a problem to be solved or a personality to be corrected, but a soul coming home to itself, and that the proper response to such a homecoming is the same as the proper response to any sacred event, which is to stand quietly at the edge of it and to consent, as far as you are able, to be changed by what you have seen. The light returns, the mask falls, the work continues, and what has been said here will go on speaking in you, in its own time and by its own counsel, long after the words themselves have settled into the deeper silence from which all true words rise. Let us sit, then, a little longer, while the lamp finds its lower steady flame, and let the night hold what we have said.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.